Plato quotes Heraclitus saying that one cannot step into the same river twice, for it is always flowing. We change over time, so the experience cannot be the same if lived twice. This is why each time I've played Bioshock over the years, the game means something different to me. But Bioshock's design goes much deeper than personal projections that I had in previous playthroughs. After pursuing a degree in game art, I better understand how games like Bioshock have a way of relaying messages to us covertly. Every element of the game strives to work cohesively to relay a grander narrative. This is why I feel compelled to transfer this understanding to gamers like me so they can better understand themselves through games. Games are not made or released in a vacuum, so it is important to understand how Bioshock's time of release was integral to its success. I'll also discuss how mapping the narrative arc can aid in analyzing Bioshock's story. Different types of immersion were used in Bioshock and helped deliver this narrative. People also have psychological needs that can be met in games and are a big part of what motivates them to play games. Bioshock's release. Bioshock was released on August 21st, 2007 by 2K Games in the Xbox 360 and PS3 era to a world that hadn't seen much like it. The first trailer 2K Games released of Bioshock raises the question of morality and portrays the game as a horror FPS. The trailer starts with a monologue from a masculine voice as the camera brings us under the surface of the ocean to reveal a large Art Deco-inspired city. What is presumed to be the player pulls a little girl out of a vent and seems to express the desire to harm her. Someone in a large diving suit with a drill for a hand tries to stop the player. The trailer ends with the player being killed by one of these divers. This is all a pre-rendered scene and vastly superior to what's possible for in-game footage at the time. The morally questionable act of attempting to kill a little girl in this first game trailer paints the player as the antagonist. Not that a game with an antagonist player is bad, and it has been done before. Hercules, for example, is quite evil with the proper perspective. The second trailer for Bioshock is much more effective for two main reasons. The first reason is the pre-rendered animation in the original trailer is very open to interpretation. Consumers don't know what the game is actually like. This hype built up for a game by its commercials is incredibly important. Games have been sold entirely on the hype with little actual content in the finished product. The second trailer, having quite a bit of in-game footage, more effectively showcases the plethora of enemies, weapons, and mechanics that Bioshock offers. The in-game characters also have a bit of stylistic gesture to them that the first pre-rendered cutscene didn't portray. The second reason is the genre of a game heavily influences the number of players in the target demographic. In 2007, mature-rated games accounted for 15.5% of games sold. Teen-rated games were 28%, and E-rated games were 56.6%. M-rated games do not sell anywhere near the amount they do today. In 2022, the top most selling games were Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, the 2022 re-release, and Elden Ring, two very violent M-rated games. However, the two most popular game genres are shooters and action games at 42% and 43% of gamers regularly playing those genres in 2022. A trailer implying violence to a minor would have been a bad platform to run on solely for Bioshock, and alludes to why a second, very different trailer was made. It is important to consider what other games were released in the same year as Bioshock, because production schedules work around the extremely important release date. Portal, a puzzle-based first-person shooter game, was released later that year in December. Both of those genres are very high on the charts for popularity. Much to the benefit of Bioshock, Crysis, another first-person shooter, was released 3 months later in November on PC and October on console in 2007. For example, Crysis on console followed the release of another FPS that changed shooters forever. Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare was released on November 5th, 2007, and has been the staple formatting and inspiration for multiplayer FPSs since. Imagine if Bioshock was released in this peak AAA November release time period and battled for people's time and Christmas gifts for the year. Instead, Bioshock had several months of lead time to get proper exposure before these other AAAs dropped. The subsequent trailers for Bioshock focused more on the action and gameplay of the game to complement 2007's action-packed release schedule. Immersion. Britannica defines immersion as a complete involvement in a task or interest. Within games, immersion can become so great that we forget we are simply interacting with a computer simulation. This level of immersion is called a suspension of disbelief. Laura Ermey and Franz Myra wrote a compelling paper about how there are three main ways that a game can immerse us: sensory immersion, challenge-based immersion, and imaginative immersion. The environment makes up most of the space we interact in and contributes heavily to sensory immersion. Journey is an effective example of a game using a predominantly audiovisual experience to create sensory immersion. Journey came out in 2012 and featured zero HUD or dialogue. The story was told through interacting with the world and pictographs. Toril Mortensen speaks of player agency. Quote, "Agency is the satisfying power to take meaningful action and see the results of our decisions and choices." Bioshock, being an action RPG, gives the player agency through its plot-driven and adventure of Rapture, the underwater city in the game. Imaginative immersion is achieved through story and compelling characters. Fighting enemies with various weapons and mechanics is where challenge-based immersion comes into Bioshock's design. The three vehicles for immersion discussed here are not mutually exclusive, though. The types of immersion form a three-bubbled Venn diagram that the player slips into during suspension of disbelief as they play. The story is directly affected by the player's interaction, and it will not progress unless the player drives it forward. The meta-narrative is affected by this Venn diagram. Bioshock uses this crossover extensively in its simple mechanics to push the narrative element. Imaginative immersion, story, and lore. Bioshock's plot, like most stories, is the product of storytelling structure. To better understand the plot structure, one can break down a story into its narrative arc and define some key character archetypes. Once these board pieces within the story are reduced a bit with these techniques, it becomes easier to tackle larger concepts and the overarching narrative of the story. Most classical stories can be broken down into 3 acts. Act 1 is where the setup, call to action, and the first plot point is established. Act 2 is everything that leads the story to the climax. Finally, Act 3 is where the call to action is addressed and the aftermath of the climax is expressed through the following action as resolution. These critical moments can also be called the story beats. However, Bioshock can be broken down into 5 acts. Traditionally, in 5-act plays, the falling action is extended into an entire act, Act 4, and the resolution encapsulates Act 5. This allows for a very strong and intense climax with lots of fallout. Shakespeare particularly liked these 5-act plays. Let's start by summarizing the story of Bioshock with a narrative arc graph. So this will be sticking just to story beats. So in Act 1, which is the exposition phase, a setup, Jack is on a plane that crashes in the middle of the Atlantic next to a lighthouse that leads down into an underwater city called Rapture. B, call to action, Jack needs to get out of Rapture with the help of Atlas. C, plot point 1, Jack gets his first plasmid. Act 2, rising action. D, conflict, Jack has to choose between harvesting little sisters or saving them. E, pacing subplot, Jack travels through Rapture. F, conflict, Jack fights enemies and overcomes various obstacles. G, plot point 2, Jack finds a room where he learns that he has been brainwashed to respond to "Would you kindly?" Act 3, climax. H, false climax, and we'll talk about that later. Jack confronts Andrew Ryan. I, false climax solution, Ryan uses Jack's brainwashing to make Jack kill him. J, narrative redirection. Jack transfers ownership of Rapture to Atlas. Atlas is actually Fontaine. Act 4, falling action. K, pacing subplot. Jack works with Tenenbaum to remove Fontaine's control and escape Rapture. L, conflict obstacle. Jack has to get 2 doses of serum to remove Jack's brainwashing, which Fontaine is using to kill Jack. M, plot point 3. Fontaine locks himself behind a security system that only little sisters and big daddies can get into. Jack disguises himself as a big daddy. Act 5, resolution. N, climax. Jack fights Fontaine. O, resolution 1 or ending 1. If the player rescued all of the little sisters, Jack brings them with him when he leaves Rapture. The girls all live great lives on the surface. P, resolution 2 or ending 2. If the player harvested one of the little sisters, Jack takes control of all of the splicers in Rapture and attacks the outside world. With this simplified narrative arc, we can see a progression of dramatic tension as we build towards the climax H, set by the call to action B and first plot point C. Jack is stuck in Rapture and Ryan controls Rapture. Ryan frequently gets in the way of Jack leaving Rapture, so there will be a crossing of wills at some point. The progress of these wills crossing creates the story. As Fontaine takes control of Rapture, Jack is forced to dance the same number, and an eventual confrontation needs to happen between them. This 10,000-foot view of the story helps us establish key players and narrative direction. Now we can start breaking sections into smaller pieces to analyze how the story advances from A to B, B to C, and so on. We can also assess if the setting of the scenes or the actions of the characters fits with the overarching narrative. If there are inconsistencies, we can decipher areas that create immersion-breaking moments or plot holes. We can also discover details that we didn't catch the first time that explains why the experience was engaging, using game psychology as well as game design. Here is a narrative arc graph of Bioshock's story that encompasses each major story event outlined in the previous shortened narrative arc, as well as key events mechanically introduced that merit discussion. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is much more complicated. This took a lot of time and quite a few edits to get here. And, let's dive in. So each level in the game is broken down into points on the graph or what they present to the player to drive the narrative forward and either uplift or lessen dramatic tension of the story. Video games are highly interactive, though, which is why this is so detailed. The story won't only be progressing by reading words on a page or hitting play on a video and getting comfy with some popcorn. The interactive element drives the story. In Bioshock, a problem arises, Jack fights and explores his way to find a fix for the problem, and then fixes it. This rhythm continues throughout the game and is more visible when graphed. Act 1, A setup. Now, I'm not going to assume that you have played Bioshock. Also, as I stated before, I have had different takes on Bioshock every time I played it. So we are going to go through the story as if I was explaining this to somebody who had never played the game, and then we will come back and analyze. So Act 1, A setup. The setup is where the time, location, universe, and norm are established. Bioshock takes place in 1960, and the game begins with the protagonist, Jack, riding an airplane. Jack holds up a wrapped gift with the words, "To Jack with love, from Mom and Dad. Would you kindly not open until," and the rest of the message is obscured by a big red bow. Then screaming is heard as the plane crashes into the ocean. After the plane crash, the player discovers that miraculously, the plane went down in front of a lighthouse in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Jack swims to the base of the lighthouse, evading burning fuel on the surface. The large brass doors are already open and darkness lurks within. With no real other choices for survival, Jack enters and seeks aid from the catastrophe now sinking into the ocean's cold depths. Jack's proximity seems to trigger the lights within the lighthouse that illuminate a large banner draped across the space. A towering brass statue of a man in a suit with a pencil-thin mustache looks down upon Jack from behind the banner. In large gold letters on bright red fabric reads, "No gods or kings, only man." B. Call to action. The call to action can be labeled by whatever is creating a conflict or deficiency that must be dealt with by the protagonist. The call to action is also where the protagonist is established. The protagonist can be multiple people, but in classical stories, it is one character. In video games, the player usually controls the protagonist. The call to action usually foreshadows the climax of the story if it follows traditional storytelling, but more on that later. In the game, Jack descends the stairs of the lighthouse as more lights activate with proximity. A warm musical note plays within a large metal spherical pod. The lights flicker on inside the pod, and a gold shimmer encapsulates a lever inside the sphere. Jack is beckoned to follow by a prompt in the UI and activate the device. The large glass door to the sphere swings shut before it sinks into the water fathoms below, like some kind of submarine. The room darkens before a screen is pulled over the window and a projector is heard humming to life. A single-frame advert is seen on screen advertising something called plasmids, offering the ability to light a cigarette with your finger. Then the projector cuts to an image of that man from the statue before, now in a luxurious office chair and smoking a pipe at his desk. "From the desk of Ryan," reads the font. Andrew Ryan introduces himself and begins his monologue.
"I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose rapture.
And with a flicker, the screen and projector go away, and the view of the large glass door is restored. The sphere we have been traveling in ascends over a rock covered in crabs, and a masterfully sublime view of a gigantic underwater city with towering skyscrapers, much like the Empire State Building, comes into view. Windows dot the side of the buildings, and neon signs glow vibrantly as if this were any other normal city like New York or Chicago. Glass-encapsulated walkways connect the buildings. A large octopus swims past the portal, and a school of fish scurry. Andrew Ryan's monologue continues to beat like a gorilla pounding its chest as he declares his ultimate vision. A city where no limits exist, where anyone can make their fortune if they work hard enough. Jack is greeted at the end of the theme park-like ride by the murder of a man pleading for his life from some woman holding meat hooks in her hands. She violently rends him open and then turns her attention to the pod Jack is in.
Is it someone new?
She asks, followed by an unsuccessful attempt to breach the pod. A voice squawks from a radio inside the submarine and offers Jack some friendly guidance. The voice belongs to a man who introduces himself as Atlas, and he is Jack's only hope of surviving Rapture's dangers. Jack's call to action comes in Atlas's steadfast words.
I'm Atlas, and I aim to keep you alive. Now keep on moving. We're gonna have to get you to higher ground.
The door flings open, and the journey begins. See Plot Point 1. Plot Point 1 is where the protagonist is put into a predicament that seals their path in the plot to address the call to action. The first plot point is also the climax of the first act. In video games, plot points are often used to introduce major mechanics, which brings us to challenge-based immersion mechanics. Chutes and ladders, or where it originated from, Moksha Patam in India, or also called snakes and ladders, can be used to explain how to approach game design. You don't need the chutes or the ladders to get to the end of the game and win. However, once you implement accelerators and decelerators, the game becomes something else entirely. A roll isn't just spaces forward, there's a chance to shoot ahead of the competition or get sucked to the back. To be extremely reductive, games follow a simple structure like chutes and ladders. The core mechanics of the game can be applied to many different themes. Monopoly has been slapping different themes on their game for years now. It is hard as idea makers not to start with an aesthetic, though, and work backward. But the game has to be playable first. Chutes and ladders could be reskinned as a sci-fi game, for example. The player is a spaceship piece. The board is a path to a new planet we are trying to terraform because the Earth is uninhabitable. Players compete to be the first to get to the new planet, and wormholes litter the path. Some of the wormholes take you closer to the planet, some farther away. The skin of the game is meaningful, but not as meaningful as the mechanics underneath. Bioshock is a first-person shooter. In most combat-based games like FPSs, the enemies are the decelerators, the chutes, and the weapons are the accelerators, the ladders. So when the player is introduced to what makes Bioshock so unique in its gameplay, combat is evolved tremendously. The plasmids of Bioshock are basically science fiction magic spells. Some scientists of Rapture were allowed to perform tests otherwise not allowed due to ethical reasons, and they discovered that a sea slug found down there at the ocean's floor held a special compound that could rewrite genetic code. They named this compound Adam. This is a narrative explanation of how you can take vials and gain various abilities or spells, plasmids. Returning to Bioshock's gameplay, a short informative cartoon explains in a rather juxtaposed jovial tune that the player can now zap people with their new plasmid. My BFA wouldn't be worth anything if I tried to work juxtaposed in here somehow. A voice over the radio explains that this ability stuns enemies and makes melee damage much more effective. Enter the first challenge-based immersion mechanic. Zap the enemy, then run in to finish them off with a melee. One can also zap enemies standing in water to multiply the damage from the plasmid. Here is where Jack seals his path and Plot Point 1 is established. Jack is committed to altering his entire genetic code with a plasmid to survive. Jack's use of the plasmid also signals to Atlas that they will be working together to escape Rapture. There are many plasmids unlocked as the game progresses that utilize various elements or turn enemies against each other. Some later weapons get ammunition that can zap or freeze enemies, but one could essentially run the entire game with zap and whack to solve the majority of their problems that require a violent solution. Act 2. Now that Act 1 is complete, the player can move forward by implementing the tools they have gained in the game. The pacing subplot can be reduced to a section of the story dedicated to exposition. The protagonist travels from point A to point B, where a conversation is had between characters that enriches backstory and lore. In Bioshock, these sections or pacing and subplot take place on Jack's way to the next objective. By navigating through the levels, the meat and potatoes of the gameplay are experienced. Players loot and fight enemies while exploring the environment. This is a great time to discuss the art that goes into Bioshock's environment design. Sensory immersion art. So, art can, like games, transport us into universes and events that we wouldn't normally be able to experience. Whether the experience is in the past, future, or impossible, the art was chosen to inspire. A game benefits immensely from a better understanding of art history, psychology, cultural anthropology, and philosophy. This way, game designers can better understand why large landscape paintings create that sublime feeling, or why a particular style of architecture can evoke a specific emotion and draw the eye in a very specific way. Then game designers can use these techniques in the environment's construction to create similar effects. The styles within Art Deco combine indigenous American and Egyptian art with the use of simplistic, clean shapes. Greco-Roman geometric stylized forms accent the structure to infuse an appropriation of long-existing cultures harboring imagery born from a deeper connection to nature and a Western lens of refinement. Rich colors infuse the style and marry natural materials with man-made plastics and concrete. Art Deco embodies scientific progress in its materials and capabilities. Art Deco also inspired a rise in the economy from the jobs it created in construction and filling these buildings with business firms and multi-floor department stores. Bioshock's environment is heavily influenced by Art Deco. Art Deco, or Style Moderne, was an art movement that started in Paris in 1925 and eventually made its way to the United States. However, American designers were not allowed to attend the expositions in Europe centered around Art Deco at the behest of the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was concerned that America had not established its own iconic American style that was appropriately new and inventive to match the 20th century. Herbert Hoover did send a delegation to the expo in Paris showcasing the latest Art Deco works. The delegation was tasked with assessing the new Art Deco style. Then, they were to return home to the United States to their positions within the American Institute of Architecture, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the New York Times. They were then to use what they learned at the expo to inspire a new boom of artistic style. The American World Fairs in Chicago and New York City showcased their own Art Deco designs, and Hollywood was ecstatic with the new style. The American surge of Art Deco came at a unique time when there was a race to build the tallest building. The interiors of these buildings adopted the lavish designs of Art Deco, and the geometric designs filled pavilions, lobbies, and the first prominent skyscrapers. Mimicking the grandiose arches and the vertical lines of Gothic architecture, Art Deco skyscrapers of the 1930s towered over civilization and drew eyes upward towards the heavens. The Chrysler Building is one such marvel filled with Art Deco design. Rapture's inspiration from Art Deco seems a natural choice, given Rapture was formally founded in 1946 and the game takes place in 1960. Art and culture have a trend of exploding after a troublesome time. The Roaring Twenties saw an explosion of celebrating life. Abby Cox has a great video about how women were challenging gender norms during this time period with shorter hair and cloche hats. Industry was booming, jazz was sweeping the world, and Art Deco grew very much. The 50s saw a similar explosion within the economy and culture following World War II. Bioshock means to take place during this revolution. Art Deco fills one with hope for the future, with its bright sconces casting light upwards and walls become entire works of art. The allure of entering the extravagant lobby of a skyscraper with craftsmanship on every surface unlike anything else in the city. The decadent workings of every surface promise to the pedestrians of these buildings that they can seize a better tomorrow. So it is fitting that Rapture, albeit a fictional place, was inspired by the same movement following World War I. Rapture was first established in 1946 and construction was completed in 1951. Art Deco's birth mirrors the birth of industry within Rapture's creation. The decadent halls and architecture make it so one can forget they are even underwater as they move through the levels in Bioshock. The art and environment in a game contribute heavily to the immersion of the experience. It's not until a pipe bursts or a large set of windows bask us in pale blue light that we remember that we are so far below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. Rapture has compelling sensory immersion or audio-visual, and is the number one reason Bioshock is so unique. D. Pacing subplot. For the first pacing subplot of Act 2, Jack needs to get to the emergency access area. It is locked, and Atlas informs Jack that Dr. Steinman may have the key. The ability to hack vending machines is introduced, and the subsequent minigame is basically a simple puzzle. The player has to reveal tiles and expose the pipe fittings underneath. A slow-moving, glowing liquid begins to fill a pipe at a starting point, and the player has to move around pieces of pipe to route the liquid to its destination square. This is a mechanic that is not necessary to complete the game, but it is a layer within it that benefits the player if they choose to indulge. The puzzles are simple enough at the start of the game and ramp up in difficulty as the game progresses. This puzzle game is another example of what is possible when one plays with accelerators and decelerators to create another opportunity for challenge-based immersion. E. Conflict obstacle. Bioshock follows a relative rhythm. This is one of the game's strong suits in terms of the gameplay loop. Game designers can use traditional storytelling structures to establish a rhythm with the player. The player will begin to instinctively know when an intense or important part of the game is coming. A conflict or obstacle needing to be dealt with following a period of pacing or subplot brings a mini-climax to the level in the game. The following levels in Bioshock follow this rhythm. A new level is introduced, the player needs to get from point A to point B, pacing subplot, and then they confront the boss or barrier that is keeping them from advancing to the next level, conflict obstacle. Then the player enters this cycle again in the next level. At this point in the campaign, Jack has gained access to Dr. Steinman's operation room. The medical pavilion has been covered with Dr. Steinman's mad contentions with beauty and surgery. The end of this level comes to a climax when the player finally meets Dr. Steinman, giving a macabre performance around several corpses, each with imperfections Dr. Steinman tried to correct, but failed. Jack fights and kills Dr. Steinman, gaining the key to emergency access. This is the conflict obstacle story beat, setting the tone for the rest of Bioshock. F. Plot point 2. Just like the previous plot point, a game-changing mechanic is introduced here with a heavy narrative impact. The Little Sisters. These little girls wear dresses with frilly lace, but have deep sunken eyes and wield a large syringe. They are protected by a large drone-like enemy armored in a large diver's suit. These guardians are called Big Daddies. The Little Sisters roam around and extract Adam from dead bodies around Rapture. Inside the Little Sisters lives a sea slug in a sort of symbiosis. Atlas advises that Jack harvest the sea slug from the Little Sister to acquire its Adam. This is where Dr. Tenenbaum is introduced, the scientist that developed the tech to make Little Sisters. Dr. Tenenbaum offers Jack an alternative that doesn't kill the Little Sisters. Dr. Tenenbaum made a special plasmid that Jack can use to separate the slug from a Little Sister without killing her and returning her to a normal, healthy girl. Less Adam is acquired with this method, but Dr. Tenenbaum offers rewards based on how many Little Sisters Jack saves. This is a common morality choice for a video game. Save or kill. Ken Levine, the creative director for System Shock 2 and Bioshock, stated in an interview for the director commentary of Bioshock that this morality choice should have been more drastic in immediate benefits. Levine goes on to explain that the player should have experienced more struggle for sacrificing power in exchange for saving the Little Sisters' lives. A prime example of an area where challenge-based immersion does overlap with imaginative immersion. There are a total of 21 little sisters to either save or harvest in Rapture. Harvesting 3 little sisters garners 480 Atom at 180 Atom per harvest. If Jack saves 3 of the little sisters, Jack gets 240 Atom at 60 per little sister. That's half the Atom. With each 3 little sisters rescued, Dr. Tenenbaum sends out 1 saved little sister to give you a teddy bear containing 200 Atom and a bunch of supplies. In the end, Jack gets 40 less Atom than if he harvests, but gets a bunch of supplies and new plasmids, so it's up to the player to decide if morality is worth sacrificing for more immediate rewards. And the Atom is basically just used at these vending machines to purchase plasmids and plasmid upgrades. So the introduction of Little Sisters and Big Daddies is plot point 2 and adds a second major mechanic to Bioshock. Dr. Tenenbaum is also introduced and will periodically speak to you regarding what's going on in Rapture. It is unclear at this point if Dr. Tenenbaum is your ally or merely another player on the board. G. Pacing subplot. Jack sets off with the weight of his decision to either save or harvest a little sister. He fights a few enemies as he travels back through the medical pavilion, one of which is a new introduction to the Napalm Splicer, an enemy that throws grenades. While looking for a way into Dr. Steinman's OR, Jack found a plasmid for telekinesis and ignite. Some of the environment is blocked off with ice, but Jack can use ignite now to melt it, which is another example where story overlaps mechanics and environment. Dr. Steinman has a tennis ball serving machine because he likes to practice his tennis swing in his office. So here, when Jack gets the telekinesis, he can now test it and practice on the tennis machine. The implied strategy here is that Jack can now grab grenades that are thrown at him by the Napalm Splicer and then launch them back, which is a great example of intuitive teaching by using diegetic props. This adds another layer to the challenge-based immersion too. H. Conflict Obstacle. Upon returning to the main entrance to the medical pavilion, Jack discovers that a little sister has wandered into the area. The area is littered with the bodies of the enemies Jack had previously killed, and the little sister begins draining those bodies of Atom. The player has to kill the Big Daddy before they can save the little sister. The Big Daddies are heavily armored and have some pretty intense moves. This conflict marks the difficult first encounter with a Big Daddy and takes quite a bit of resources to bring down. I. Pacing subplot. Jack uses the emergency access key to enter Neptune's bounty through a bathysphere. This level is where Rapture's fisheries are located. Box of fish and crabs can be found everywhere, and dock-like structures connect sections. The objective in Neptune's bounty is to make it to the lower levels of Fontaine's fishery, where Atlas's family is being held inside a bathysphere. The player is introduced to a new enemy type here, the Spider Splicer. The splicer that killed Johnny outside of the bathysphere at the beginning of the game was actually a Spider Splicer. Psychotic acrobats that derive pleasure from toying with their prey, Spider Splicers offer a new challenge with their ability to climb on ceilings and do quite a bit of damage with their dual hooks. The introduction of these enemies is important because the player doesn't just see one and fight it. You see, Jack enters a hallway that bends at the end and a large shadow is cast on a far wall. The figure is crouched low, looking back and forth intently. To Jack's right, a sign sits submerged partly under a flooded section of the hallway. The sign reads, 91 days since our last incident. Jack makes his way down this hallway toward the shadow. Before Jack can round that corner, though, to greet the crouched figure, he sees the shadow leap upward and disappear. And once around that corner, Jack sees that the form was crouched over a corpse and has jumped into a hole in the ceiling. A shadow above darts away and red petals gently fall from the hole, basked in warm light. Jack continues into the next room and hears the mad whispers of that figure that leapt into the crawl space above the ceiling.
But the days go by like wind.
More red petals waft down from the grate below the pipes. Whatever is left of the human hunting Jack is only glimpsed through shadows, building the tension. The environment design in Bioshock is quite stunning when it is utilized this way. The player could more than likely find their way through the level, but the developers of Bioshock steep the environment with ambiance. The hallway isn't just lit, it's lit at strategic points to guide the player at all times. The player can instinctively know where to go because a light shines across from them into another area. The entire experience might as well be like living inside a chiaroscuro painting. There is also a new daddy introduced called a Rosie. The Rosie Big Daddy is a little longer limbed than the previous Big Daddy and wields a large rivet gun. This is the first Big Daddy with a ranged ability and can toss proximity mines. The player will need to find a new, more complex strategy to deal with the Big Daddy. The ranged attack it uses can be dodged, but that requires constant multitasking to move back and forth at just the right time. Being immersed when focusing on manipulating the controls, coupled with visual cues as the Big Daddy attacks you, falls under challenge-based immersion. But there is a reason that a particular type of immersion can be more enticing to some people. We all have psychological needs past our physical needs. Some of these psychological needs can be satisfied by escaping through immersion into a video game. Many different kinds of needs can be satisfied by games. A publication by Andrew Shabilsky et al. Categorizes needs met in games as competence, autonomy, relatedness, and mastery of controls. Competence is the ability to assess what a player needs to do and then do it. When what is needed to be done increases in difficulty, the player can figure it out and fulfill their need for competence. Autonomy refers to the ability to make choices within a game's space. The evolution of video game complexity has created more autonomy for players. For example, the player can choose whether or not to utilize the hacking mechanic in Bioshock, giving them autonomy. Relatedness within video games is satiated by playing with other people. This one doesn't really apply to Bioshock. You imagine just a dystopian future where you shuck corn. This one doesn't really apply to Bioshock much as it is a single-player story game, but an MMO that promotes a socialization through an in-game economy and finding guilds to play with fulfills this need. Finally, the mastery of controls is much more self-explanatory. Real life is actually very complicated, and any action requires a lot of coordination between body and mind. Whereas in a video game, climbing a mountainside can be reduced to a few button presses. The mastery of these controls to overcome various obstacles can be very fulfilling. The added complexity of fighting the new Rosie Big Daddy deepens this challenge-based immersion through a mastery of controls. Plot point 3. Back to the gameplay. This plot point is presented with the need to acquire a camera to trade for passage into another area. Taking pictures of enemies ranks up the player's research of these enemies. Photographing multiple enemies while they are performing actions raises the graded quality of the photo and gives more progress to the player's research. If the player researches the enemies through photography enough, they rank up and gain bonus damages to these enemies. They can also earn plasmids from that research. One plasmid in particular is quite powerful and makes the player invisible if they stand still. Again, this entire camera mechanic is a layer of accelerators requiring skill-based use of the mechanic to reduce the time to kill enemies. So we have a mastery of controls to complete that action, as well as the challenge-based immersion created by trying to complete that action, and then the autonomy in whether or not to actually utilize this mechanic completely. Games that incorporate multiple ways for players to best the challenges set in front of them open up the gameplay to more audiences. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is not an all-encompassing way to describe how people find enjoyment through games, but it does help us greatly in categorizing gameplay and what is needed to enjoy higher complexity of mechanics. The basic premise of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that one cannot engage or satisfy needs higher on the pyramid until the lower needs are met. Gameplay loops can bounce between these levels in various rhythms to create rewarding or punishing gameplay. If the player does not have a tier of needs met in their real life, they may seek out or enjoy content based on those needs. This is part of why MMOs offering community and peer-to-peer engagement are so successful. But as far as the complexity of controls goes, it isn't necessarily a negative that the player can go through the entire game just zapping and whacking. Zapping and whacking can be very effective and rewarding if the gameplay loop and environment provide enough situations to maneuver to use it. The player needs Eve, or mana, to use their plasmids. Eve can be acquired from enemies as loot, be found in the environment, be bought from vending machines, or acquired from perks and passive plasmids. The vending machines themselves can be hacked to lower the price of items, so this gameplay loop of just feeding the zap and whack has a tricky system of accelerators and decelerators available to the player. Bioshock doesn't really have any mechanics involving the first level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, since the first level is all primal survival needs. You don't get hungry or need to sleep in Bioshock. The majority of Bioshock could be understood and played simply by managing the second tier of needs on the pyramid. The player must simply manage the security of the body, resources, and health. Most action-based games have these basic mechanics. Call of Duty's multiplayer basically lives in the second tier, and Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 2022 version is the most sold game of 2022 for retail and digital sales, meaning it's a pretty popular area to stay in. Bioshock's gameplay can be approached with varying complexity of resource management and plasmid weapon combos per enemy type. The use of mechanics to solve various problems when done effectively creates challenge-based immersion, like when a chess player is so focused on the board and the pieces that nothing else matters. If the player wishes to engage with characters on the radio beyond updating the quest log, they can find higher levels in Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the story and subtext. One could argue that imaginative immersion requires that the first two levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs are satisfied if they are included. This is why it works in Bioshock's case to not also have to worry about hunger, sleep, or using the restroom like a survival game. Imagine someone's dying of thirst. Waving a bottle of water around and then going on a rant about how on a socioeconomic level megacorporations have caused their thirst is just kind of disjointed and malicious. Instead, giving them the water to fill that need then makes the explanation palatable. K. Conflict Obstacle. Returning to the story, Peach Wilkins, the man who tasked Jack with acquiring the camera and taking 3 pictures of spider splicers, demands that Jack surrender his firearms before Peach opens the door. Atlas takes this opportunity to let Jack know he still has his plasmids. With no real other choice, the player is forced to submit. A glowing pneumatic tube receptacle, or pneumo as it's called in the game, signals to the player where to deposit their weapons. Jack enters Peach Wilkins' lair and is beset upon by Peach and his gang in a fog-filled freezer. The player only has their plasmids and wrench to fend off all attackers. This moment in the game echoes the previous analysis of game mechanics. Before surrendering their weapons, the player had acquired a shotgun, machine gun, pistol, grenade launcher, and various ammo types for each weapon. This is quite the arsenal, but the first strategy introduced in the game is still effective. Zap 'em and whack 'em. It's all shoots and ladders. L. Pacing subplot. After defeating Peach Wilkins and his gang, Jack makes his way to the smuggler's hideout, a haven tucked away inside a cave that Fontaine has been using to smuggle goods into Rapture. A single-use weapon upgrade station is introduced here. The general upgrades are a capacity increase, a damage increase, a recoil reduction, or a fire rate increase. The upgrades are visually represented by modifications made to the actual weapon in Jack's hand. The modification glows yellow hot and cools to reveal the changes the upgrade has made. This audio and visual addition vastly improves player attention. The player's connection to their equipment would be much less compelling if the upgrade was only seen as a faster depletion of the target's health bar. M. Plot point 4. Jack makes it to an observation room with a lever overlooking a large bathysphere. Atlas calls in over the radio to request a lever be pulled so he can be led into the area below, housing that bathysphere. Jack attempts to pull the lever, but it short circuits and malfunctioning beeps come from the mechanism as the lights go out. Atlas enters the large room below and begins working at the controls in front of the bathysphere, presumably trying to open it so that he can get his wife and kid out. Andrew Ryan starts taunting Jack over the radio. If only the lights didn't go out in the observation room above, Jack might be able to warn Atlas that something is very, very wrong. Splicers begin piling into the room with the bathysphere, and Jack's vision is obscured by a large pipe that falls from the ceiling. Gunshots can be heard, and Atlas exclaims that he needs to retreat from the splicers. Atlas requests that Jack come in and save his family. Jack frantically makes his way to the bathysphere below, but as soon as he gets close to the bathysphere, it explodes abruptly. It can be assumed that Andrew Ryan detonated the bathysphere somehow, as he broadcasts to Jack immediately after, asking why Jack has come to Rapture. Through tears, Atlas directs Jack to get out of there and make his way to Arcadia.
Jesus Christ!
This is a very important moment for Jack and the player. After the murder of Atlas's wife and child, Atlas dedicates himself to Andrew Ryan's destruction. Empathetically, the player and Jack feel the desire to do so as well. That bathysphere was supposed to be Jack's way out of Rapture. Andrew Ryan solidified himself as a villain by murdering Atlas's innocent wife and child while Jack helplessly watches. If there was some small redeemable element to Andrew Ryan to Jack, Ryan murdered it at that moment and made it personal. End pacing subplot. Jack enters Arcadia with a heavy heart. Atlas then explains how the next objective is to make it to the metro station, which will then grant Jack access to where Andrew Ryan is. To get to the metro area, Jack must find a botanist named Julie Langford. Langford's office is next to the metro access. While Jack makes his way to Langford's office, Ryan pumps poison into Arcadia, killing all of its plants. There's a noticeable shift in Ryan's priorities as he focuses on stopping Jack and anyone that tries to help him. Arcadia is a part of Rapture that is filled with plants, and the entire area is set up like a park.
My trees!
When Jack gets to Langford's office, she tells Jack he needs to find a special flower she developed from the sea slug with regenerative properties. Jack makes his way through the dead forest to find this magical plant so they can hopefully restore the ecosystem in Arcadia. O conflict obstacle. As Jack returns with the flower, Andrew Ryan pumps poisonous gas into Julie Langford's office.
No, please!
With her last dying action, Langford scrawls the combination to her safe in the gunk on the window that was left behind by the gas. After the gas dissipates, Jack opens the safe and finds an audio log containing a recipe for bringing the plants back. The conflict obstacle here being Langford is dead and Rapture is running out of oxygen. Even enemies can be heard commenting on how it's getting more difficult to breathe. P. Pacing subplot. Jack gathers the ingredients needed to synthesize a spray that will revitalize the plants. Some of the ingredients are in the farmer's market area on the other side of Arcadia. Q. Conflict obstacle. Jack has gathered all the ingredients to synthesize the spray that will fix the plants in Rapture. The concoction is put into the misting machine, and it begins filling the air. A large team of splicers start breaking their way into Langford's office to stop Jack. The climax of this level and section of the game is the large fight here and the conclusion of saving the plants, which returns Rapture's system to recycling carbon dioxide into oxygen. R. Pacing subplot. After fending off the waves of splicers, Jack makes his way to the metro station, now accessible in Arcadia, to travel to Fort Frolic. From Fort Frolic, Jack should be able to use another bathysphere that leads to Hephaestus, where Andrew Ryan's office is located.
Deep breath and enjoy it. Then head over to Rolling Hills and get the bathysphere. Next stop is Ryan's house. It's time for blood.
S. Conflict obstacle. Jack makes his way through the lobby of Fort Frolic into the bathysphere that leads to the section of Rapture that houses Andrew Ryan's office. But then suddenly, the bathysphere sinks before Jack can reach it. Atlas has previously explained over the radio that Fort Frolic was run by the psychopathic artist extraordinaire, Sander Cohen.
A real lunatic. Join the whole psychopath.
Spotlights flicker on and illuminate figures covered in plaster and posed in acrobatic positions. The room is lined with large red-purple curtains, and a voice chimes in over a speaker system.
That's better. Atlas Ryan. Atlas Ryan.
Sander Cohen apparently would like Jack to first experience some of his work before he can proceed. Fort Frolic seems to be the theater district of Rapture, and Cohen was one of the prominent figures within the art scene. Before Jack can continue to Andrew Ryan's office, he must first satisfy whatever odd request Cohen has for him.
Welcome to Fort Frolic.
T. Pacing subplot. It would seem Cohen has suffered some psychotic break since the collapse of Rapture. Not that Cohen was completely sane before Rapture collapsed. There are 4 apprentices that Cohen has had a falling out with, and Jack must track down these disciples and kill them.
Could you possibly think I would meet with my public now when I'm preparing? Unbelievable.
Fort Frolic is littered with corpses that Cohen has posed and covered with some type of plaster. Cohen's masterpiece has several of these corpses in various poses holding empty picture frames. Here is where the caveat to Cohen's task comes in. Jack must take a picture of the dead disciples and put their pictures in the frames. With little choice, Jack sets forth on his task. Jack enters an auditorium at the behest of Cohen. On stage left, Fitzpatrick, the pianist and first disciple, sits nervously playing the piano. But Fitzpatrick keeps screwing up, so Cohen detonates an explosive inside the piano, killing Fitzpatrick. Cohen then reminds Jack to take a picture of Fitzpatrick's burning corpse. So Jack heads to the main stairway where the multiple picture frames hang and adds the picture of Fitzpatrick. A trapdoor opens and Jack is offered a small reward for his compliance. Plot point 3. While hunting down Sander Cohen's other disciples, Jack comes across an establishment called Eve's Garden XXX. The Dead Star performer of which is Jasmine Jolene. Jack finds out through audio logs and a memory echo that Jolene was a mistress of Andrew Ryan. Jolene had been paid by Tenenbaum to get pregnant by Ryan. Then Tenenbaum would take the fertilized egg out. Through a memory echo, it would appear that Ryan killed Jolene once he found out Fontaine was involved in the process of getting the egg. Jolene's corpse is on the bed in her dressing room in the back of Eve's garden. Regarding memory echoes, the game explains that people's memories live within their DNA and that Adam can transfer it from person to person. Remember that Adam is recycled by Little Sisters. Their sole purpose is to retrieve Adam from corpses around Rapture so it can be reused in plasmids. These visions occur throughout the game, but they aren't utilized much past adding to the horror of Rapture's dilapidated condition. This is one of the few times, though, that the echo is pertinent to Jack's story.
I'm gonna know I sold the... Mr. Ryan's gonna be so mad at me.
The conflict obstacle. After Jack has killed the remaining disciples and taken their picture, he returns to Sander Cohen's masterpiece to add the pictures. Cohen thanks Jack by sending in several waves of splicers. Oh, thank you.
Fly away, little moth! Fly!
This is a prolonged battle, but it's not particularly difficult if the player is stocked up on equipment. Once all the splicers have been killed, Cohen descends from a large staircase under spotlights to bask in his finished masterpiece. He then offers a final reward to Jack, a glass case securing a large plasmid. Cohen explains how Jack may now leave Fort Frolic and proceed to Hephaestus. Before leaving, though, the player is also presented with the option of killing Cohen now that he has exposed himself. Pacing subplot. When Jack travels to Hephaestus, he has to fight his way through various splicers to find the entrance to Andrew Ryan's office. Conflict obstacle. The entry to Ryan's office is protected by a powerful security system. However, through found audio logs, Jack finds out that he needs to shut down the power core to cut the power supplying the security system. Pacing plot. While searching for a way to shut down the power core, Jack comes across audio logs from Kyberts, who was also trying to get into Andrew Ryan's office by building an EMP, or an electromagnetic pulse bomb, to shut down the power core. Jack finds the incomplete bomb in a secret room in Kybert's office. To complete the bomb, Jack must acquire specific ingredients from around Hephaestus. So, Jack sets off to gather them. Conflict obstacle. Jack eventually finds all of the ingredients and returns to Kybert's office to complete the EMP. The EMP is lugged to the core and Jack sets it off. He has to fight his way through Andrew Ryan's drones and splicers at this point. And now, Jack is able to enter the Rapture Control Center.
All that matters to me is me. And all that matters to you is you. It is nature.
Act 3. AA, plot point 5. Jack enters the Rapture control room where Andrew Ryan's likeness flickers on the screen of a large computer structure in the center of the room. Ryan is quite angry with Jack at this point and sets off some self-destruct function in Rapture's computer. While Jack is racing to Ryan's office to stop the countdown, Jack comes across a very odd room. The room is a workspace used by Dr. Suchong. Would You Kindly is painted in big red letters on a wall covered in notes and pictures of the key players Jack has been interacting with at Rapture. An audio log rests on the counter with a heavy message from Dr. Suchong. The doctor has been working with Fontaine to create some genetically altered child that grows at an accelerated rate.
Advanced deployment, Lot 111, Dr. Suchong, client Fontaine Futuristics. Baby is now a year old, weighs 58 pounds, and possesses gross musculature of a fit 19-year-old. The results are disappointing, but within expected tolerances.
A second audio log plays a recording from a session with a genetically altered little boy. Dr. Suchong orders the child to kill his puppy. The child protests and begins to cry. Then Dr. Suchong, using the words in red, "Would you kindly?" and the boy carries out the order, much to the doctor's pleasure.
No, please. Break that puppy's neck. Do you kindly? No. No. Very good.
The autolog is titled Mind Control Test. BB false climax, and we'll explain why it's a false climax later. The context of this climax was set once it was established that Andrew Ryan was the ruler of this underwater metropolis. The constant antagonization by Ryan through all of the story beats leading up to this point solidified that Jack would eventually meet Ryan. Ryan didn't help Jack at all through the entire game. Ryan was continuously suspicious and blocked Jack's progress at every turn. So it is a classic and natural climax to finally come face to face with the antagonist. Many classical stories follow this structure, and it can be expected. There is a valid reason for this classic structure. The writer spent a great deal of time setting up the entire structure of the narrative arc to lead to this very moment. It is of great surprise that once Jack finally meets Andrew Ryan face to face, Ryan explains that Jack is the genetically altered baby Dr. Suchong and Fontaine made. If we remember what we learned from plot point 3, the embryo Jack was made from was taken from Jolene, who was impregnated by Ryan. So Jack is essentially Ryan's son. CC false climax solution. Jack has been conditioned to have memories that aren't real and respond to a phrase without restraint. The note on the gift from Jack's parents contained the words, "Would you kindly," from plot point 5, and it triggered Jack's brainwashing. Jack was the one who actually brought the plane down over Rapture. Inside the gift was a revolver, so Jack could hijack the plane. Ryan then begins to give Jack orders using the phrase, "Would you kindly," moving around Jack like a trained dog.
Would you kindly? Stand! Would you kindly? Run! Stop! Turn. A man chooses. A slave obeys.
Then unexpectedly, Ryan hands the golf club he has been holding to Jack and orders him to kill. Ryan painfully exclaims between swings at his cranium,
A man chooses. A slave obeys. Obey!
Jack continues to beat Ryan, his father, to death with a golf club. DD narrative redirection. The computer is still in self-destruct mode, so Jack runs to the computer in Andrew Ryan's office and puts Ryan's genetic key into the machine. After inserting the key into the machine, the self-destruct ceases. But then Atlas gives Jack the biggest twist. Atlas is actually Fontaine, and has indeed been controlling Jack the entire time. Now Fontaine has control of all of Rapture.
Nice work by all.
Fontaine sends a bunch of security bots after Jack, and he is forced to flee. While running out of the office, Jack sees a saved little sister. The little girl tells Jack to follow her, and she runs off to a vent that another little girl has opened. Together they crawl through the vent, and while crawling to safety, Jack cries out in pain and loses consciousness. Act 4. EE pacing subplot. Jack wakes up on a bed in what appears to be Tenenbaum's sanctuary for the saved Little Sisters. The Little Sisters dragged Jack to safety after he lost consciousness and Tenenbaum stabilized him. FF pacing subplot. Tenenbaum explains to Jack that Fontaine has several ways to control Jack. If either of them is going to get out of Rapture, Tenenbaum and Jack will have to work together. Tenenbaum informs Jack that there may be answers on how to reverse the mind control hidden in Dr. Suchong's flat in Mercury Suites. GG, plot point 6. Fontaine tries to use the command, "Would you kindly" on Jack, but it doesn't work.
I says, would you kindly go get stepped on by a big daddy?
Tenenbaum was able to remove that form of control on Jack while he was unconscious, it seems, but Fontaine uses another phrase to control Jack.
Code yellow.
This makes Jack's heart stop momentarily. HH pacing subplot. Jack makes his way through Mercury Suites to find Dr. Suchong's office. Inside the doctor's office, an audio log explains that Fontaine had an antidote made to reverse any form of mind control. Fontaine was paranoid that Jack or the mind control may be used against him. The antidote is called Lot 192, and Tenenbaum thinks it could be located in Dr. Suchong's lab near Apollo Square. Tenenbaum had also stolen a dose of the substance before she knew what it was and stashed it in her flat on the second floor of Mercury Suites. Jack makes his way to Tenenbaum's apartment to secure the dose of Lot 192. As it turns out, Fontaine had Tenenbaum's flat searched and the vial of Lot 192 was taken. Tenenbaum suspects it was brought to Fontaine's penthouse near the lobby of this level. Jack sets off to breach the security around Fontaine's penthouse and find the dose of Lot 192. II, conflict obstacle. After retrieving a dose of Lot 192 in Fontaine's penthouse, Jack's plasmids cycle uncontrollably. He must find the second dose of Lot 192 to stop it. Tenenbaum had previously mentioned that she stole a vial from Suchong's lab near Apollo Square. Jack is now forced to use whatever plasmid he cycles to under this condition, but in the meantime, Fontaine is unable to control Jack. It is important to point out that as the plasmids cycle, the player is forced to adopt strategies randomly. It is a clever tactic to mix things up so late in the game. The player may find a use for a plasmid that they hadn't discovered before, but there may also be moments where the randomized plasmid isn't very helpful. A drawback to the mechanic is that every time the plasmid shifts, it forces Jack to equip it, putting away their weapon. A minor inconvenience, but a large penalty on a higher difficulty setting. Difficulty settings within a video game can be a blessing or a curse. By making the game harder, the game's core mechanics become much more important. Games aren't usually playtested to be perfect on super hard mode. They are playtested to work on normal difficulty, which means that if there is a small flaw in a mechanic, a larger spotlight will be cast onto it. An enemy's attack range could be slightly off from their visible reach. An attack that previously only did a sixth of the player's health bar in damage now does 3/4 of it, and the visual cue discrepancy is a bigger problem. Difficulty settings are a nice way to give players the option for replayability or just more challenge-based immersion, but that previous scale of various immersion tools trying to balance themselves can be more easily broken when these mistakes happen. Suspension of disbelief can be broken when a player encounters a mistake, and the enjoyment of the game suffers. If it doesn't break the game too much, difficulty settings can be fun. As previously mentioned, they can add replayability or entice players that want a larger challenge. This is usually achieved just by increasing enemy damage inflicted upon the player and decreasing the damage that the player does to enemies. The higher the difficulty, the more disproportionate the buffs and debuffs. This boils down encounters to equations. So a strategy to take down a Big Daddy, for example, could be to run around a room of obstacles to set up for a good burst of damage on the Big Daddy. On normal difficulty, it could take the player 5 or 6 revolutions of the strategy to bring down the Big Daddy. On the hardest difficulty, it could now take the player 5 more revolutions to bring down that Big Daddy. This would be agonizingly slow and incentivizes using the game's deeper mechanics like taking pictures of enemies to learn what their weak points are and then get damage buffs because of that. Then, after that, craft or buy the ammunition that does more damage to those enemies. It also incentivizes experimenting with other plasmids to find an easier way to bring that run around the room down a few iterations. Very rarely do games implement systems that are only activated once the difficulty is raised. For example, if enemies became more aggressive and used moves that were only used in those higher difficulties. From a production standpoint, this falls under dreams and if there's time or money to explore it. Obviously not a priority. Difficulty settings, fulfilling the mastery of controls need through challenge-based immersion may only appeal to a small demographic within the player base. These types of changes could very well break the entire system that was already built over months of production and might not be worth developing. JJ pacing subplot. Back to the narrative. With Jack still cycling plasmids uncontrollably, he makes his way to Apollo Square to find the second dose of Lot 192 in Suchong's office at Artemis Heights. While Jack is walking to Artemis Heights, he finds an audio log left by a Diane McClintock.
I was so angry when I came down here, but my God, I had no idea. There were armed men all over the place. I saw a woman climb over the fence trying to escape. One of Ryan's guards pointed at her and she lit on fire. Just like that. What's happening here?
Further along the metro tracks, there is a square where a gallows has been erected with 3 corpses hung by the neck. A large sign in the middle of the gallows reads, Gene Trader. KK, conflict, obstacle. Upon entering Dr. Suchong's office, Jack sees the remains of a scientist pinned to a desktop by a Big Daddy's drill. An audio log next to the corpse recounts a note taken by Dr. Suchong explaining the difficulty of trying to get Big Daddies to imprint on the little sisters and protect them. During this recording, a little sister keeps trying to get Dr. Suchong's attention, and eventually, Dr. Suchong snaps at the little sister before hitting her. After that, Dr. Suchong can be heard getting his comeuppance as a Big Daddy spins up his drill and pierces him. Ironic that Dr. Suchong would cause the event that makes a Big Daddy protect a little sister.
Shush! Sure. The sequence to allow for...
Get away, you filthy little shit!
What? What are you doing? Get back! Get back!
The second dose of Lot 192 is on a counter in this room. After drinking the tincture, Jack regains control of his plasmids. Tenenbaum calls Jack over the radio and congratulates him on freeing himself from Dr. Suchong's mind control. Jack is directed to head to Point Prometheus. Presumably, Point Prometheus is where Fontaine is hiding. After getting the dose, a team of Splicer comes in and attacks Jack. Jack now has to fight his way back through the level. LL pacing subplot. There is an optional area to explore in Apollo Square. Fontaine had built an orphanage and poorhouse in this optional area. Upon entering the compound, Fontaine calls Jack on the radio and explains how easy it was to recruit followers in Rapture by simply offering the homeless a home and the poor a meal. Inside the orphanage is the office of Frank Fontaine, where the body of Diane McClintock can be found next to an audio log. In the recording, Fontaine explains how he has faked his death and assumed the identity of Atlas. Unfortunately, Diane McClintock walked in on Atlas, talking in his previous voice, Frank Fontaine. With his optional area complete, Jack continues on to Point Prometheus. On his way there, Fontaine calls him over the radio and gives him an opportunity to join forces, so there isn't really a way to accept this, so it's kind of hollow. Conflict obstacle. As the bathysphere pulls into Point Prometheus, Frank Fontaine can be seen standing on the other side of the glass. Fontaine antagonizes Jack and brags that he has injected himself with all of the atom in Rapture. Men, am I right?
The atom in the city, pal, and I ain't shy about using it. Now, I'm Jake to take her out for a spin.
What is this you wait for? Go and get this idiot!
The bathysphere opens and the chase begins. Jack is hot on Fontaine's heels, but Fontaine keeps throwing obstacles at Jack. Eventually, Fontaine retreats behind a large door where Jack isn't able to follow. Tenenbaum expresses his agitation with the situation, and after a moment of thought, comes up with a solution.
Shite! You let him get away!
The door that Fontaine has locked himself behind is only accessible by little sisters and big daddies, which means Jack just needs to make himself pass as a big daddy to get a little sister to open the door. NN pacing subplot. The area around the giant locked door Fontaine is hiding behind has a couple of directions Jack can explore. Conveniently, Point Prometheus is where big daddies and little sisters are made, so Jack sets out through the complex to find clothing and pheromones so that he smells, looks, and sounds like a big daddy. Plot point 7. While disguising himself, Jack wanders through the facility where little sisters are made. Some of the procedures to pass as a big daddy actually require irreversible changes to Jack's body, but Fontaine must be stopped. With little choice, Jack submits himself to various mutilations. Jack's voice box is physically altered with what looks like a spinning egg beater made of blades. The horrific surgeries and conditioning that Big Daddies and Little Sisters go through is completely exposed in this section of the game. An audio log is even found containing Andrew Ryan's distaste for the appearance of Little Sisters.
On my walk today, I had my first encounter with terrible. He, lumbering Toluca in a foul-smelling diving suit, and she, an unwashed moppet in a filthy pink smock. Her pallor was off, green and morbid. And there was a rather unpleasant aspect to her demeanor, as if she were in an altogether different place than the rest of us. I understand the need for such creatures. I just wish they could make them more presentable.
PP pacing subplot. Now that Jack Daddy looks, smells, and sounds like a Big Daddy, he makes his way to the Proving Grounds. The Proving Grounds is where Little Sisters get their training. Jack needs a little sister to help him open doors only they can fit through, the hope being that a little sister will bond with Jack, the stand-in Mr. Bubbles. It should not be lost on the player that they have to become one of the lumbering hulks that are on the game's cover to save themselves from rapture. This materialization from a plane crash survivor to in the literal shoes of Rapture's fearful protectors creates a meta-narrative moment at least worth noting.
Fontaine waits above. There will be no going back from here. Make sure you are ready to face him before moving on.
Act 5, QQ Climax. Jack enters the chamber Fontaine has locked himself in. A large open room precedes the entryway. At the far end of the room towers a large machine with tubes leading from gigantic vials to a contraption holding a large man. Glowing red liquid surges into the Titan-like man from the vials. Turns out it's Frank Fontaine. He's completely transformed himself from how much Adam he has injected. Cracks erupt on Fontaine's skin and glow like lava under a thin crust. Tenenbaum urges Jack to jab the needle given to him by the little sister into Fontaine. 4 Adam canister icons pop up in the top left of the screen below the health bar labeled Fontaine's Adam. Jack now enters the first phase of the boss fight with Titan Fontaine. Fontaine erupts into flames and begins charging around the room. The strategy here is to damage Fontaine from a distance and dodge his lunges and fireballs. It is also important to point out that if the player uses opposite elements on Fontaine, the attacks are more effective. While in his flame phase, Fontaine can be frozen stiff with a blast from the chemical thrower. Once Fontaine's health bar has been depleted, Fontaine jumps back into the giant machine and begins filling himself with more Adam. Jack rushes forward to jam the syringe into Fontaine a second time. The second phase of the boss fight starts after Fontaine leaps from the machine. Now Fontaine is in an ice phase and hurls large icicle balls at Jack. With the proper escalation of challenge-based immersion, Fontaine adds security bots to the fight. It's easy enough for Jack to stun and hack them, though. Fontaine's health bar is reduced, and he runs back to the machine to get more Adam. For the third time, Jack stabs Fontaine with a syringe and removes another vial. There was only one vial left, and Fontaine angrily slams into the center of the room. Electric current seethes through Fontaine's body. In this phase, Fontaine can throw lightning bolts. Another level of difficulty is added as a gang of Fontaine's splicers enter the room to fight. Now Jack has to fend off multiple attackers. After Jack reduces Fontaine's health bar for the final time, he sprints forward to suck the last vial of Adam from Fontaine. However, this time, while Jack is drawing the magic serum from Fontaine's mutated body, Fontaine rips an arm from the restraints and backhands Jack across the room. An in-game cutscene begins. Jack is laying on the ground and watches as Fontaine staggers closer with the syringe sticking out of his chest. Just before Fontaine can end Jack, little sisters pile onto Fontaine and... Oh, I need to go feed my cat. 1 second! Alright, I'm back. Little sisters pile onto Fontaine and jab him to death with syringes. The screen fades to black as Jack watches the life slip from Fontaine while at least 5 adolescent girls stab him over and over. RR Falling Action. The Little Sisters offer Jack the key to controlling Rapture. SS Resolution 1, or Ending 1. If the player has rescued all of the Little Sisters, Jack refuses the key to Rapture. Instead, Jack brings all of the saved little girls with him when he leaves Rapture. The girls all live great lives on the surface. The game shows a small bit of cutscene where Jack's hand can be seen falling limp, presumably of old age and in a hospital, as several women's hands hold it.
And in the end, what was your reward? You never said, but I think I know. A family.
TT Resolution 2, or Ending 2. Here's where the game has received some critique. The Little Sisters also save Jack from Fontaine in the final boss fight, regardless of how many Little Sisters the player chose to kill. If the player harvests more than one of the Little Sisters, Jack takes control of all of the splicers in Rapture and attacks the outside world.
You took what you wanted. All the Adam, all the power. And the Rapture trembled. But in the end, even the Rapture was not enough for you. Your father was terrified the world would try to steal the secrets of his city. But not you, for now you have stolen the terrible secrets of the world.
Critique. The boss fight with Fontaine isn't very complicated. It's a boss fight. But that is well within the standards for games in 2007. Are there games that push boss fight mechanics before and around the time? Yes. But then again, we need to remember that the purpose of Bioshock was to hit a large demographic, which it did. The morality of choosing to save little girls or killing them has been lightly debated in forums since Bioshock's release, but it does speak to a person's axiom, what they choose to do. It is just a video game, and it doesn't matter if the player chooses either choice. However, from the perspective of the player who holds themselves to the standard of living their praxis, even in video games, they could be rewarded. Andrew Ryan didn't value human life. He valued his own freedom to exploit life beneath him. The real enemy to Ryan was people having the ability to critique him and protect themselves from him. That is, after all, what the government is supposed to do. The efficacy of that is up for debate, though. So if the player chooses to kill the children for immediate gain, they should be rewarded with an ending that aligns with their depravity. Andrew Ryan used these children, and so did the player. There shouldn't be any children left to help him finish off Fontaine if they chose to harvest all the Little Sisters. To the individual that chose to value human life and save the children, the short cutscene where Jack gives the children a real life above the surface fits with their axiom. The intricacies of the moral choices in the game could always be more complex. The developers have agreed to this in later interviews. However, the storyline does fit more with the positive moral path. The player gets gifts with various supplies, an ending to a boss fight that repays their kindness to the Little Sisters, and they get happy lives. With the narrative arc of Bioshock mapped, we can see that the final climax of Act 5 falls lower than the perceived climax of Act 3. That is because there is an immense build-up to the "would you kindly reveal" AA, and Ryan using it to commit suicide via Jack CC. Then after Jack hands over control of Rapture over to Atlas, it is revealed that Atlas is actually Fontaine, DD. If following a traditional 5-act play structure, Acts 4 and 5 should have been lengthy falling action and resolution. Instead, we are left with a grand twist of basically replacing Ryan with Fontaine. The falling action is supposed to be a downward movement, and the developers would have needed to create a build-up greater than the climax of Act 3 and Act 4 to then take out Fontaine in Act 5. Furthermore, why does Fontaine want Jack dead? The majority of the game was filled with Jack fighting through impossible scenarios and altering himself to become a very strong ally. Later, in Act 4, Fontaine does offer that they join forces, but it is done well after trying to kill Jack several times. Maybe if Fontaine felt threatened by Jack because he chose to rescue the Little Sisters, he would see that Jack's moral compass wouldn't align with his once his identity of being Fontaine was revealed. Then, if the player chose to harvest all the Little Sisters, Fontaine could see that there was potential in Jack, and that could have been a different divergent story. Ken Levine alludes to Andrew Ryan and Rapture being based on a Randian perspective of industry. Randian being a reference to Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand wrote several books from the 1930s to the 1950s. Ayn Rand's books and personal philosophy are that humans should strive to produce. All endeavors and exploits should be motivated by the individual's need to survive, so we should focus solely on producing to survive. Ayn Rand's philosophy is called objectivism. Ayn Rand claims that she is the first to scientifically answer the question of what our code of values should be as humans. Quote, metaphysically, life is the only phenomenon that is the end in itself, a value gained and kept by a constant process of action, quoted from her essay in The Objectivist Ethics, written in 1961. Objectivism argues that humans should act purely out of selfish need. It argues there is a natural goodness to greed. Morality, or this expectation that people should be nice, generous, or care about others beyond how it serves themselves, interrupts that optimized decision-making process. Ayn Rand argued that the wealthy shouldn't bother donating to charity because their selfishness is what's actually driving the economy. A question from Mike Wallace in an interview in 1959 with Ayn Rand was,
and you believe that there should be no right by the government to tax. You believe that there should be no such thing as welfare legislation, unemployment compensation, regulation during times of stress, certain kinds of rent controls and things like that.
That's right. I'm opposed to all forms of control. I am for an absolute, laissez-faire, free, unregulated economy. Let me put it briefly. I'm for the separation of state and economics.
This is later poked at by a question from Mike Wallace.
How do we build roads, sanitation facilities, hospitals, schools? If the government is not permitted to force, if you will, by vote, taxation, use your word, we have to depend upon the trickle-down theory, upon the noblesse oblige, the largesse.
I will answer you by asking you a question. Who pays for all those things?
All of us pay for these things.
When you admit that you want to take money by force from someone and ask me how are we going to build hospitals or roads, you admit that someone is producing the money, the wealth, that will make those roads possible. Now you have no right to tell the man who produced the wealth in what way you want him to spend it.
An argument made by Bioshock is that under objectivism, the power structure will cycle extremely chaotically. The top power will be a governing force for all decisions, in this case, Andrew Ryan, which will make people under them very unhappy, because Ryan controls everything in Rapture, which will create someone who wants to take the top position, Frank Fontaine, and through objectivism, Fontaine is justified to do so. He is empowered by objectivism to take Ryan's power. But Ryan, who says they believe in freedom and is against governing powers, will use any means necessary to keep his position. We see this in Bioshock while traveling through Artemis Heights in Part JJ. Ryan uses his plasmid-powered goons to execute people who stand up against him. This is exactly what Ayn Rand says she is against the government for, the use of government force against people. In this chaotic ideology, it will cycle perceived freedom, but then it becomes too governing and is taken down. When the structure comes down, everyone suffers. The structure is threatened, and society is on the verge of collapse, much like what happened to Rapture. This is why we benefit from having regulations to benefit us as a whole, but should always be open to alteration to make it better. Before World War II, America focused inward economically and politically, but after World War II, America took a strong position in helping rebuild the war-torn European cities. This opportunity for America enabled U.S. businesses to flourish around the world. The GI Bill enabled veterans to start businesses or attend college and also raised the standard of living for many Americans. Well, that's not completely true. It was only white Americans. Anyway, many other systems were starting to be set in place to help Americans live better lives because after World War II ended, a third of America still lived in poverty. Today, 2023, these systems and ideologies are seen as socialist. Andrew Ryan ran to the depths of the Atlantic Ocean to create a city where this objectivist freedom could be achieved. Ryan valued industry above everything. In Ryan's opening monologue, he said that in America, the sweat of a man's brow belongs to the poor. When Ryan said the poor in his monologue, he meant the working class benefiting from socialist systems paid for by taxes. Dwight D. Eisenhower was president of the United States from 1953 to 1961 and pushed for many socially beneficial policies. He created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Eisenhower was also known for planning D-Day and pushing Congress to create NASA. Eisenhower was also very supportive of Roosevelt's New Deal programs and high taxes for the ultra-wealthy. Mr. Beat has a great video titled The President Who Saved the World, and I highly recommend checking it out. It gave me a lot of inspiration to talk about Eisenhower here. When Andrew Ryan referred to the sweat of his brow, he meant his profit. This means Ryan saw his profits as an ultra-wealthy person as his own, not the poor from which he siphoned them, which is why Ryan left America to create Rapture. No one had the strength, as he saw it, to create a space where the market could really be free, or at least free for him. Andrew Ryan loved industry so much that he created this metaphor called the Great Chain. The Great Chain is pulled by the hands of man, and it pulls man with it. It's almost a deity or force of its own that compels men through industry.
I believe in no God, no invisible man in the sky. But there is something more powerful than each of us, a combination of our efforts, a great chain of industry that unites us. But it is only when we struggle in our own interest that the chain pulls society in the right direction. The chain is too powerful and too mysterious for any government to guide. Any man who tells you different either has his hand in your pocket or a pistol to your neck.
The Great Chain in Bioshock was influenced by a concept coined as the invisible hand by Adam Smith. Emma Rothschild wrote a paper attributing the invisible hand to Adam Smith and what it meant. Quote, "The invisible hand is an ironic but useful joke." Rothschild says that Smith refers to the invisible hand 3 times in his literature. Once in his History of Astronomy to mean a mythical interpretation of natural forces like lightning and drought, the invisible hand of the gods at work. The second is in Smith's The Theory of Moral Settlements from 1759 to describe how the rich could care less about humanity and only seek vain consumption of goods, extravagant goods made by thousands of poor, meager workers who will never be able to afford the items they make. The poor laborers are led by the invisible hand to, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interest of society. The third reference to the invisible hand made by Smith was in The Wealth of Nations in 1776, which criticizes domestic monopolies as they will favor their growth and will impose difficulties on international trade so their products are more desirable. The invisible hand actually restricts the free market, coming full circle to Ayn Rand's objectivism and a glaring logical fallacy. If man is to only focus on personal gain, then what happens when his personal gain is in direct opposition to another's? This is where the argument that no regulation leads to freedom falls short. Freedom, TM, is defined as the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. An individual doesn't exist within a vacuum. There must be some means of multiple individuals ensuring that one of them doesn't intrude on another one's freedom, TM. After all, there's about, 7 billion of us on this planet? So how is this achieved? A community establishing guidelines or systems by which they abide with agreed upon means of enforcement. Government. But government needs checks and balances. So what happened when Andrew Ryan created Rapture? Rapture never really had a truly free market like he said he wanted. Andrew Ryan controlled everything. This is ultimately the issue with Ayn Rand's objectivism. Too many have already amassed power and wealth. Once the restrictions are lifted on the ultra-wealthy, they'll just do what Andrew Ryan did. Then, when Frank Fontaine, who was acting upon his own personal gain as well, opposed the interests of Andrew Ryan, Ryan used force against people. Andrew Ryan created such a vast wealth gap that Frank Fontaine was able to destroy his entire empire by simply giving the poor Ryan hated so much food and shelter.
Don't forget that somebody's got to scrub the toilets. What an angle they gave me. I hand these mugs a cot and a bowl of soup, and they give me their lives. Who needs an army when I got Fontaine's Home for the Poor?
Let's discuss the length of Bioshock's gameplay momentarily. The typical Broadway play is 2.5 hours, whereas the average box office film in 2021 was 130 minutes long. How Long to Beat lists Bioshock as taking an average of 12 hours to complete the story. How Long to Beat's stats say that the average role-playing game takes over 41 hours to complete. So Bioshock is actually quite short in comparison to most RPGs. When playing through Bioshock again for this essay, it took me 6 hours and 19 minutes of gameplay to just get to the Andrew Ryan climax, with a max playthrough time of 11 hours and 1 minute, meaning Act 4 and 5 were 3 hours and 42 minutes long. This is not ample time to build the same climax. This length is more indicative of a 5-act play, adding extensive exposition to the falling action and resolution. Further dissonance is realized by the two different endings in Bioshock, as seen in the narrative arc SS on the chart, where Jack takes the little sisters out of Rapture and they all live a happy life. TT is where Jack takes over Rapture and commands the Splicers to attack the world above. These are such extreme outcomes that aren't fleshed out past a short cutscene. TT is such an extreme, it seems completely out of line with character development of Jack established throughout the story. Maybe if Jack had exhibited some sign of slipping into madness or hatred after finding out he is Andrew Ryan's bastard genetically modified puppet son, then TT would have made more sense as an ending. However, there would have needed to be more progression down that road. How does Jack get enough people to attack the world after murdering 3/4 of Rapture's population while going through the game? This is why TT's location on the narrative arc is so off in space. Bioshock could have just ended in Act 3, with Ryan bludgeoning himself to death by proxy, and Fontaine taking over. Bioshock 2 could have opened with Jack waking up in Tenenbaum's hideout, and the writers would have had an entire game to address setting up Fontaine as the villain. There is quite a bit of subplot established in Act 4 about how Fontaine uses people, but Ryan made Rapture. Act 4 is so full of subplots exposing the terrible things Ryan did, like seeing the poor as parasites and murdering them. Fontaine was merely allowed to fester like a malignant tumor until it killed its host. Ryan is shown to be more of a monster than Fontaine through these discoveries, which is more of a negative against Andrew Ryan's Randian-inspired ideology than anything else. But we only know this because we broke down the story into a narrative arc and can see that the climax in Act 3 has much more dramatic tension than fighting Fontaine in Act 5. In fact, for the majority of Jack's time in Rapture, Fontaine is helping Jack escape. Andrew Ryan was as much of an obstacle to Fontaine as he was for Jack. Act 4 also contains several audio logs solidifying Andrew Ryan's complicity in the creation of Little Sisters. He is only put off by their appearance. To Fontaine, the poor below Ryan was at least worth something. This does not redeem Fontaine. Again, Fontaine is a byproduct of what Rapture, or Randian objectivism, really creates. This is why Rapture was the real antagonist. This would have been a complete narrative if the good ending involved Rapture being destroyed when Jack left. Even from the evil ending perspective, Rapture needed to be dealt with in some way. Nothing is being produced to keep Rapture sustainable. It is in extreme disrepair and chaos. Why would Fontaine or Jack even want to control Rapture? Perhaps if it was implied that Rapture was still being manned and maintained in some way. This could have made Jack the antagonist some way because he tried to destroy any working infrastructure that was left with that EMP. So, to further the argument that Rapture is the true antagonist, in Act 2, conflict obstacle, the oxygen supply in Rapture is threatened after Ryan poisons all the plants, but there isn't actually a time limit or effect on Jack to back up this dire need to fix the plants other than the HUD directs the player to the next step. This could have been a great opportunity to introduce mechanics that show the player their basic need for survival is being threatened, or that it could be implemented as a moral option. Maybe the oxygen levels won't become fatal until a month later, and Jack will most likely be gone by then. Will everyone else in Rapture suffocate in a month, or will an area with some loot later be inaccessible because it has lost oxygen? Earlier, the gameplay loop of Bioshock had been defined as a problem arises, Jack fights and explores his way to the solution, then fixes the problem. Other games with a similar length have effectively used this rhythm. The 2017 reimagining of Prey can be reduced to a simple loop. The player attempts to escape the space station, and that means of escape becomes inaccessible before the player can get there. On How Long to Beat, Prey is listed as taking about 16 hours to beat the main story on average. Much like Bioshock in Act 4, Prey becomes repetitive in its race to escape, but being constantly thwarted. The antagonist transcends Andrew Ryan, Fontaine, or the Typhon, which are the aliens in Prey. The antagonist becomes the space station or Rapture itself through gameplay loops like this. The deeper analysis of this game through a myriad of academic means has illuminated some plot holes and design flaws in Bioshock. Poetically, this is mirrored in the developers not fully addressing the true antagonist in the game. Jack fights Fontaine, but leaves Rapture to remain. Should Rapture have been leveled? I mean, the science discovered at Rapture to alter the human genome was demonstratively exhibited to bring out the worst in humanity. Jack couldn't be so naive to think that the above-ground governments wouldn't want to get their hands on Adam. I don't even know if the developers realized that Rapture is the true antagonist here. This would explain why Jack didn't, and the story went the direction it did in Act 4 and Act 5. The developers have basically alluded to they would have liked to do more here, so we can learn from this application of these theories and strategies that I've applied to Bioshock on how to better, I guess, retroactively stop problems like this. Conclusion. Bioshock is relatively short for an action RPG, though the RPG element is rather simple. The game was released at an ideal time and is of a genre that remains popular to this day. The art team worked hard to bring the environment to life, combining Art Deco and a metropolis deep under the sea. The audio and visuals create ample opportunity to become immersed through the senses, sensory immersion. The game is approachable with its mechanics, offering a means for players to utilize more complex systems if they so choose. Challenge-based immersion, competence, autonomy, and mastery of controls needs. The story flows towards a graphable structure, and it is supported by subplot through the environment and supplementary lore in the forms of audio logs. Imaginative immersion, autonomy, and competence need. Bioshock has a grander narrative, albeit flawed, based on real-world history and philosophy that the player is exposed to covertly through references researched by the developers. The overt elements of the game resonate with players, and there is a profound reason for it. The vehicles within the story are based upon the known world and economic and social systems we interact with daily. The systems are just put into a world where they are allowed to grow like a culture in a petri dish in isolation from the outside world. Then we, as the players, get to explore the dilapidated structure it created and judge posthumously. Gonzalo Frasca wrote a compelling paper called Rethinking Agency and Immersion, Video Games as a Means of Consciousness Raising, about how we as game designers have an obligation to expose players to mind-expanding situations not normally available to them. The response to Bioshock's limited morality dynamics and outcomes because of those choices is a testament to the consumer's desire to have deeper moral systems in games. There is also a strong argument as to why we, as artists, should make games like Bioshock. Bioshock critiques blind capitalism. It cries for the lives of the poor and exploited. The splicers of Rapture have become so twisted against their own good that they follow Rapture's orders to their death against the one person that would save them, Jack. There is ample opportunity in Bioshock for me to explain various game psychology theories to better equip readers and gamers. When looking for a game one might enjoy in the future, consider what mechanics the game is offering aside from its skin. What does the game possess in terms of filling those needs that we spoke of previously? That competence, autonomy, relatedness, and a mastery of controls. And which of those do you find yourself most drawn to and enjoy? Is the aesthetic hollow, or is it reinforced by a story? Hopefully, this video inspires you to better understand your own psychological needs you fulfill through gaming.
Not yet. Well, I hope you have somebody to carry on your family name. Look at the bright side. Maybe it'll be quick and painless.